surrounded by 30 of her closest friends. This community pool is now reserved for my daughter's suite. 16, she declared, waving a forged document. But what Patricia didn't know was that Marcus had been recording everything from his kitchen window. And when she woke up the next morning to find her community pool completely drained with a massive sign reading BYOW, bring your own water, she realized she had just declared war on the Marcus Chen had always believed that good fences made good neighbors. What he hadn't counted on was living next to Patricia Whitmore, a woman who treated property lines like mere suggestions and HOA bylaws like her personal constitution. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday evening in late July. Marcus was in his kitchen, preparing dinner after a long day debugging code at the tech firm where he worked as a senior software engineer. When he heard voices in his backyard, not just voices, laughter splashing, and what sounded distinctly like a party, he peered through his kitchen window and felt his blood pressure spike. The pool he'd personally researched, designed, and overseen the construction of were at least a dozen teenagers he'd never seen before. They were cannonballing off his diving board, using his pool floats, and treating his property like their personal water park. But it wasn't the teenagers that made his hands clench into fists. It was the woman standing on his deck like she owned the place, Patricia Whitmore, HOA president and self-appointed queen of Willow Creek Estates. Marcus grabbed his keys and stormed outside, his bare feet slapping against the hot concrete as he rounded the corner of his house. The gate to his backyard, his private fenced backyard, stood wide open. "Excuse me," Marcus's voice cut through the splashing and teenage chatter. "What the hell is going on here?" Patricia turned toward him with the kind of smile that politicians practiced in Mirzal teeth and no warmth. She was a woman in her early 50s who had clearly once been beautiful and refused to accept that time had moved on. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled despite the poolside humidity, and she wore a flowing caftan that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Oh, Marcus," she called out, as if greeting an old friend at a barbecue. "Perfect timing. I was just about to come find you." "Find me? This is my house, my pool. What are these people doing here?" Patricia's smile never wavered. "Well, that's what I wanted to discuss. You see, my daughter Brittany is having her Sweet 16 party this weekend, and we need to use the community pool." Marcus stared at her, certain he'd misheard. "Community pool, Patricia. This is my pool, on my property, behind my fence." Actually, Patricia reached into her designer purse and pulled out what appeared to be an official document. According to the HOA bylaws, Section 12-4, any recreational facilities that can be seen from common areas are considered community amenities and can be reserved for HOA events. Marcus felt like he'd been punched in the gut 3 times. "Oh, it's very real," Patricia said, waving the paper. "I had our legal team draft an amendment last month. It was voted on and approved by the board." "What board meeting?" "I never received notice of any emergency meeting," Patricia interrupted smoothly. "We only notify residents who are directly affected by specific agenda items. Since this was about community recreational facilities in general, we didn't need to notify individual homeowners." Marcus felt his engineering mind trying to process the logical fallacies in her statement. But his emotional mind was too busy being furious to engage in rational analysis. "Get out of my pool." The teenagers who had been listening to this exchange with the kind of fascination that only comes from watching adults behave badly began to murmur among themselves. A few started to climb out of the water. "Nobody move," Patricia commanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. She turned back to Marcus, and now the fake smile was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. "I understand you're upset. Marcus's change is hard. But this is bigger than your personal feelings about your backyard swimming hole." "Swimming hole?" Marcus's voice rose an octave. "I spent $43,000 on this pool, and it's beautiful," Patricia said, gesturing grandly. "Which is exactly why it's perfect for community events. Brittany's party is this Saturday. We'll need it from noon to 6 p.m. I've already hired the caterers and the DJ. You can't just isn't legal. You can't just declare my private property a community asset." Patricia's laugh was like wind chimes made of ice. "Oh, Marcus, you really should read your HOA agreement more carefully. When you bought this house, you agreed to abide by all current and future HOA decisions. The board has the authority to Make determinations about community welfare and recreational access. Show me the bylaw, Marcus demanded, so briefly that someone who wasn't trained to debug complex systems might have missed it. But Marcus caught it, and in that microsecond of hesitation, he knew she was lying. I don't carry the full bylaws with me, she said finally, but you can request a copy from the management company. It takes about 2 weeks to process. 2 weeks. Convenient, since her daughter's party was in 4 days. Marcus pulled out his phone and started recording. I'm documenting this trespass. I want everyone out of my pool and off my property immediately.
Trespass.
Patricia's voice was sharp now, all pretense of friendliness abandoned. This is community property, Marcus, and frankly, your attitude is exactly the kind of selfish behavior that's destroying neighborhood cohesion. My attitude? You broke into my backyard. The gate was open. It was locked. Well, it's open now. Patricia shrugged, as if the laws of physics were merely inconvenient suggestions. Look, I'm trying to be reasonable here. Brittany has been planning this party for months. I've already spent $7,000 on deposits. Marcus looked at the teenagers in his pool. They were watching this adult confrontation with the kind of uncomfortable fascination of people witnessing a car accident. One girl, presumably Brittany, was floating on his favorite pool lounger, pointedly not making eye contact. This isn't about the party, Marcus said, still recording. This is about you breaking into my private property and then trying to gaslight me into thinking it's legal. Gaslight? Patricia's voice went up several octaves. Did you just accuse me of gaslighting? I am the HOA president, Marcus. I've been managing this community for 8 years. Software engineer Marcus corrected automatically, then immediately regretted, giving her more ammunition. Whatever. You don't volunteer for community events. You don't participate in the neighborhood watch. And now, when we need to use community resources for an actual community event, you want to be difficult. Marcus felt the familiar frustration of dealing with someone who moved goalposts faster than he could address their arguments. Patricia, this is my property. I have a deed. I pay property taxes on it. I have homeowners insurance on it. My name is on the utility bills for the pool equipment. In the universe where you signed an HOA agreement that gives the board discretionary authority over community welfare decisions, Patricia shot back. But fine. Hi, this is Patricia Whitmore, HOA, president for Willow Creek Estates. I need to report a homeowner who's interfering with an approved community event, ... Yes, I'll hold. Marcus stared at her in disbelief. Who are you calling? The police, Patricia said maturely. You're disrupting a permitted community gathering. This is insane, Marcus muttered, but he kept recording. After a moment, Patricia spoke into her phone again. Yes. Hi. I am at 247 Maple Lane. The homeowner here is trying to prevent community members from using the community pool for an HOA-approved event. Yes, we have the proper documentation. Thank you. They'll be here in 15 minutes. She hung up and smiled at Marcus with the kind of satisfaction usually reserved for people who just won the lottery. The police will sort this out. Marcus felt like he was living in some kind of alternate reality. Patricia, when the police get here, I'm going to show them my deed, my property tax records, and my homeowners insurance policy. What exactly are you going to show them? This, Patricia said, waving the document again. Can I see it? It's a legal document. I'm not required to share confidential HOA business with non-board members. I'm a homeowner in this HOA. A right to review any bylaws that affect my property. You have a right to request copies through proper channels, which, as I mentioned, takes 2 weeks. Marcus should have known that Patricia Whitmore wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. The first sign came at 6:47 a.m. the next morning, when he was awakened by the sound of his doorbell ringing with the persistence of a smoke alarm. Stumbled to the front door in his pajamas and found a man in a county inspector's uniform standing on his porch, clipboard in hand, and the expression of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. Marcus Chen, the inspector asked, consulting his paperwork. Yes. I'm Dave Martinez from the county building department. We received a complaint about unpermitted pool construction and potential safety violations. I need to inspect your backyard pool. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Unpermitted. I have all the permits. I have the inspection records. Everything was done legally. I'm sure it was, Dave said with the weary tone of someone who'd dealt with too many HOA disputes. "But when we get a complaint, we have to investigate. Can I see your pool?" Marcus led him through the house to the backyard, his mind racing. The pool had been installed 3 years ago. Every permit had been obtained, every inspection had been passed, every box had been checked. He'd been obsessive about it, specifically because he'd heard horror stories about people having to tear out pools due to permit issues. Dave walked around the pool area, taking photos and making notes. "Everything looks good to me," he said. After a few minutes, "Mind if I see your permit documentation?" Marcus disappeared into his house and returned with a thick folder containing every piece of paperwork related to the pool construction. Dave flipped through it, nodding. "This is all in order. More thorough than most people, actually." He looked up at Marcus with something that might have been sympathy. "Between you and me, whoever filed this complaint probably knows it's bogus. This is usually just harassment." "Patricia Whitmore," Marcus said. Dave's expression shifted to something like recognition. "Ah, Willow Creek Estates. You've dealt with her before. Let's just say your neighborhood generates a disproportionate number of complaint calls." Dave closed the folder and handed it back. "Your pool is fine, Mr. Chen, fully compliant. But I'd document this whole interaction if I were you." Marcus thanked Dave and walked him to the door. But as soon as the inspector's truck disappeared down the street, Marcus's phone rang. "Mr. Chen, this is Sandra from Willow Creek Property Management. I'm calling about some compliance issues with your property." Marcus closed his eyes. "What compliance issues?" "Well, we've received reports that your pool area doesn't meet HOA aesthetic standards. There are also concerns about noise violations and improper storage of pool equipment." "Sandra, have you actually seen my pool area?" "I'm just relaying the complaints we've received. You'll need to schedule an inspection with our compliance officer." "When how's this afternoon?" Marcus looked at his watch. It was barely 8 a.m. this afternoon. "Don't you need to give more notice?" The HOA agreement allows for expedited inspections when there are safety or aesthetic concerns. Marcus felt the familiar sensation of being trapped in someone else's illogical system. "Fine. What time?" 2 o'clock. The compliance officer will be Janet Rosenberg. She'll need access to your entire backyard." After hanging up, Marcus sat at his kitchen table and pulled up the HOA bylaws on his laptop. He'd read them before, but now he was going to study them like he was debugging critical code. If Patricia wanted to play games with rules and regulations, he was going to make sure he knew every loophole and limitation. 3 hours later, he was an expert in the Willow Creek Estates HOA governing documents. He'd also discovered something interesting. Patricia Whitmore's own property had several violations that had apparently been overlooked by the compliance department. At exactly 2 p.m., Janet Rosenberg arrived. She was a thin woman in her 40s, with the kind of pinched expression that suggested she'd been born disapproving of things. "Mr. Chen, I'm here about the compliance inspection." Marcus led her to the backyard, where she immediately began taking photos and making notes with an intensity that would have impressed a crime scene investigator. "The pool equipment shed is too close to the property line," she announced after measuring with a tape measure. Marcus checked his own copy of the HOA rules. The bylaws say pool equipment must be at least 6 feet from the property line. Shed is 8 feet away. Janet remeasured, frowning. "The fence line might be incorrect. I have a survey. The fence line is exactly on the property boundary." Janet moved on to other potential violations. The pool deck was supposedly the wrong color. It wasn't. It was one of the 3 approved colors listed in the architectural guidelines. The pool lights were allegedly too bright. They were the same LED system used in the community center pool. The landscaping around the pool wasn't harmonious with the neighborhood aesthetic. It had been designed by the same landscape architect who'd done the HOA president's front yard. After an hour of this, Marcus was beginning to understand the strategy. Patricia couldn't make his pool community property, so she was going to make owning it as difficult and expensive as possible. "I'll need to file a report with the board," Janet said finally. "You'll receive a letter detailing any required remediation within 10 business days." "Janet," Marcus said, as she packed up her measuring tools, "just out of curiosity, when was the last time you did a compliance inspection on 251 Maple Lane?" Janet looked puzzled. "I don't think I've ever inspected that property." "Why? That's Patricia Whitmore's house." I was just wondering if her front yard fire pit meets the setback requirements. Janet's expression shifted slightly. Fire pit. Yeah, she had one installed last month. Looks like it might be a little close to the sidewalk, but I'm sure it's been properly inspected. Marcus watched Janet make a note on her clipboard. Sometimes the best way to debug a system was to introduce a few test cases and see how it responded. That evening, Marcus was grilling dinner on his patio when his neighbor, Jim Walsh, appeared at the fence line. Jim was a retired firefighter who'd lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone except the original developer. "Hell of a thing yesterday," Jim said, leaning against the fence. "You heard about that?" "Marcus, the whole neighborhood heard about it. Patricia was on the phone for hours last night, calling everyone she could think of, trying to drum up support for some kind of petition." Marcus felt his appetite disappear. What kind of petition? Something about selfish homeowners who won't share community resources. She's trying to frame it like you're some kind of neighborhood villain. "Jim, it's my pool on my property. I know that, and anyone with half a brain knows that. But Patricia's got a talent for making people forget inconvenient facts when it suits her agenda." Marcus set down his spatula. "How much support is she getting? More than you'd hope, less than she needs. There are always people who will go along with anything if you make it sound official enough." Jim paused. "But there are also people who remember when Patricia tried to ban Christmas decorations because they weren't culturally inclusive, and then put up the biggest display in the neighborhood on her own house. So what do? Document everything. And maybe start thinking about your own counter-strategy." Jim's words echoed in Marcus's head as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. Patricia had made it clear that she wasn't going to stop with yesterday's humiliation. She was going to use every tool at her disposal to make his life miserable. But Marcus was beginning to realize that Patricia might have underestimated her. Opponent, she saw a quiet software engineer who kept to himself and didn't attend HOA meetings. What she didn't see was someone who'd spent 15 years solving problems that other people said were impossible. The next morning brought a new escalation. Marcus was checking his email over coffee when he found a message from his homeowner's insurance company. "Dear Mr. Chen, we have received a report of potential safety hazards at your property related to an unpermitted pool installation. Please contact our office immediately to discuss your coverage." Marcus called the insurance company and spent 30 minutes explaining to a representative that his pool was fully permitted and had passed all required inspections. The representative was apologetic, but explained that they had to investigate any safety complaints. "Who filed the complaint?" Marcus asked. "I'm not allowed to share that information, but the complaint was filed by someone identifying themselves as an HOA representative." After hanging up, Marcus sat in his kitchen and realized that Patricia wasn't just trying to make pool ownership difficult. She was trying to make it impossible. If she could get his insurance company to drop his coverage, or if she could create enough bureaucratic headaches with permits and inspections, she could force him to fill in the pool entirely. It was a scorched earth strategy, and it was probably going to work unless Marcus found a way to fight back. He opened his laptop and began researching HOA law, property rights, and harassment statutes. If Patricia wanted to turn this into a legal battle, he was going to make sure he understood every weapon at his disposal. But as he read, a different kind of idea began to form. Patricia's strength was her position as HOA president and her willingness to abuse that authority, but what if that strength could become a weakness? Marcus pulled up the HOA bylaws again, but this time he wasn't looking faux. Marcus spent the weekend implementing what he privately called Operation Dry Season. It was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution, the kind of solution that could only come from someone who understood both engineering principles and human psychology. The plan required 3 components: perfect timing, complete documentation, and a sign that would become legendary in HOA warfare folklore. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made suburban lawns look like magazine covers. Patricia was probably having her coffee and planning her next move in what she undoubtedly saw as her inevitable victory over the antisocial engineer, who'd dared to challenge her authority. What she didn't know was that Marcus had been awake since 4 a.m., implementing the final phase of his counterattack. At exactly 7:30 a.m., just as the neighborhood was waking up and people were getting ready for work, Marcus activated the pool's drainage system the custom pump he'd installed over the weekend, industrial-grade unit designed for emergency pool evacuations, began its work with the quiet efficiency of a Swiss watch. 15,000 gallons of crystal-clear water disappeared through the municipal storm drain system in under 2 hours, leaving behind a pristine concrete basin that looked like an empty swimming pool-shaped grave. But the real matter wasn't the drained pool, it was the sign. Marcus had spent considerable time crafting the message, testing different fonts and layouts, until he achieved the perfect balance of professionalism and passive-aggressive malice. The final result was a 4-foot by 3-foot weatherproof banner that he mounted on the pool deck with the precision of a military flag ceremony. The sign read, "Community pool temporarily closed for maintenance bio. Bring your own water pool management. Thanks you for your patience questions. Contact HOA President Patricia Whitmore. Pool refill scheduled. TBD below the text." In smaller but perfectly legible print, this community amenity is managed according to HOA by law 12-4, as interpreted by Community Pool Administrator Patricia Whitmore. All pool users are responsible for providing their own water, cleaning supplies, and pool maintenance. Diving board and pool equipment available for community use on a first-come, first-served basis. Marcus stepped back to admire his work. The sign looked completely official, with a kind of corporate blandness that made bureaucratic announcements simultaneously authoritative and infuriating. Anyone reading it would immediately understand exactly what had happened. While being unable to argue with the logic, the first reaction came from Mrs. Chen next door, no relation, despite the shared surname, who appeared at her back fence at 9:15 a.m. with a cup of coffee and a bewildered expression. "Marcus, what happened to your pool?" "Community maintenance," Marcus replied, gesturing to the sign. "HOA business?" Mrs. Chen read the banner, and Marcus watched her face cycle through confusion, understanding, and finally delighted recognition of the beautiful absurdity of the situation. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You didn't. I absolutely did. Patricia is going to lose her mind. Patricia declared this pool community property. I'm just managing it according to her specifications." Mrs. Chen pulled out her phone and started taking pictures. "This is going to be all over the neighborhood Facebook group within the hour." She was wrong. It took 12 minutes. Marcus watched from his kitchen window as neighbors began appearing in increasing numbers. Drawn by the social media buzz and the universal human fascination with dramatic neighborhood conflicts, by 10 a.m., there were at least 20 people standing around his backyard fence, taking photos and videos of the empty pool and its explanatory signage. The conversations were exactly what Marcus had hoped for. Wait, so she really tried to claim his pool was community property? And then she called the county on him for having an unpermitted pool. "Look at this sign, bring your own water." That's hilarious. I heard she's been filing complaints about everyone who doesn't go along with her crazy ideas. Remember, when she tried to ban wind chimes and then installed that fountain that runs all night, Marcus had inadvertently created the neighborhood's first viral social media event. Videos of the empty pool and its sign were being shared across multiple platforms, with commentary ranging from supportive "this is what happens when HOA Karens get too big for their britches," to analytical "this is actually a brilliant legal strategy, he's complying with her demands while making them impossible to fulfill." The first angry phone call came at 10:47 a.m. "What the hell did you do to the pool?" Patricia's voice was shaking with rage. "I drained it for maintenance," Marcus replied calmly. "Community property requires community management, right?" I figured. "The community should be responsible for providing the water too. You can't just drain the pool." "Why not? It's community property. The community can manage it however they want." That's not to her being deliberately obtuse. "Patricia, I'm following your logic to its natural conclusion. You declared my pool community property. You said the community needs access to recreational facilities. Well, here's your community pool. The community is welcome to use it anytime they want. There's no water in it. That's what the sign is for. BYOW, bring your own water. Very environmentally conscious approach, don't you think?" Marcus could hear Patricia breathing heavily through the phone, probably trying to figure out how to respond to a situation that was simultaneously completely unreasonable and perfectly logical. "Fill it back up," she said finally. "I'm sorry." "What? Fill the pool back up right now?" "Patricia, are you giving me orders about what to do with community property?" Because if this is community property, shouldn't community management decisions be made by the community? I'm the HOA president, and I'm the pool administrator, apparently, according to your own sign there. Pool management thanks the community for their patience during this maintenance period. You made that sign? I made a sign explaining the community pool policies as established by HOA President Patricia Whitmore. I thought it was important to give you proper credit for your innovative community resource management strategy. The silence on the other end of the line stretched out long enough that Marcus wondered if Patricia had hung up or suffered some kind of stress-induced medical episode. Marcus, she said finally, her voice deadly quiet, fill up that pool or I will make your life a living hell. Patricia, my life has been a living hell since you broke into my backyard and tried to steal my pool. The difference is, now it's your problem too. He hung up. The next call came 15 minutes later from Sandra at the property management company. Mr. Chen, we've received complaints about your pool being drained without proper notification. Sandra, I'm managing the community pool according to HOA guidelines. Was I supposed to notify the community about maintenance on community property? The community pool? According to HOA President Patricia Whitmore, my pool is community property available for community use. I'm just following her guidance on community resource management. Sandra's pause suggested she was trying to process information that didn't fit into any of her standard procedural frameworks. Mr. Chen, I think there might be some confusion about the pool ownership situation. No confusion on my end. I have a deed showing I own the property, and I have documentation of Mrs. Whitmore's position that the pool is community property. I'm managing both situations simultaneously. Could you... Could you explain what that means? It means the community is welcome to use the pool anytime they want. They just need to bring their own water, and pool chemicals, and probably some cleaning supplies. Community property means community responsibility, right? Sandra made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Mr. Chen, I think you need to speak directly with Mrs. Whitmore about this situation. I tried that. She hung up on me. After Sandra hung up, Marcus poured himself a coffee and settled in to watch the neighborhood's reaction to his community pool management strategy. The crowd around his fence had grown to include people from other streets, drawn by the social media coverage and word-of-mouth buzz. Someone had started a hashtag #BYOW. The neighborhood Facebook group had exploded with commentary, memes, and heated debates about HOA overreach, property rights, and the ethics of passive-aggressive warfare. But the real entertainment came from watching people try to figure out how to use a community pool with no water. A few kids had climbed down into the shallow end and were pretending to swim. Someone had brought a beach ball and was playing catch in the deep end. One entrepreneurial teenager had set up a folding chair in the pool basin and was charging people $5 to take pictures of themselves swimming in the community pool. Marcus was documenting everything with his phone when Jim Walsh appeared. At the fence again, you magnificent bastard, Jim said, grinning. This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. It's just community resource management, Marcus replied innocently. Patricia's been driving around the neighborhood for the last hour, stopping at every house to try to drum up support for some kind of emergency HOA meeting. How's that going for her? Well, let's just say the optics aren't great. She's trying to explain why she needs emergency powers to force you to fill up your community pool while you're standing there offering to let anyone use it anytime they want. The Willow Creek Estates Community Center had never seen anything like it. What should have been a sparsely attended emergency HOA meeting had turned into standing room only, with overflow crowds spilling into the hallway and people live streaming the proceedings on multiple social media platforms. Marcus arrived 30 minutes early, carrying a leather portfolio that contained 3 months of research into HOA law, board procedures, and Patricia Whitmore's own violations of the governing documents. He'd dressed for battle in his best suit, the one he wore to client presentations when millions of dollars were on the line. What he found was a community center packed with more neighbors than he'd ever seen in one place. The viral nature of the pool situation had drawn residents from across the development, many of whom had their own grievances with Patricia's leadership, but had never found a rallying point until now. Marcus, Sarah from Oak Street waved him over to where she'd saved a seat in the front row. Channel 7 is here, and someone from the county attorney's office. This is insane. Marcus looked around at the crowd and felt a moment of vertigo. What had started as a property dispute had somehow evolved into a referendum on HOA governance. The empty pool had become a symbol of resistance against petty authoritarianism, and he'd accidentally positioned himself as the leader of a movement he'd never intended to start. Patricia entered at exactly 7 p.m., flanked by the other board members like a general with her staff. She looked around at the packed room with barely concealed horror. Clearly having expected the usual crowd of 8 or 10 people who normally attended HOA meetings, this meeting will come to order, she announced, her voice carrying the strained quality of someone trying to project authority while feeling it slip away. We're here tonight to address a serious violation of community standards by one of our residents. Marcus stood up. Point of order. Patricia's head snapped toward him. Excuse me. Parliamentary procedure requires that emergency meetings follow specific protocols. According to the HOA bylaws, Section 4-7, emergency meetings can only be called to address immediate threats to community safety or property values. I'd like to know which category applies to an empty swimming pool on private property. A murmur went through the crowd. Patricia looked at her fellow board members, none of whom seemed eager to answer. The disruption to community harmony, Patricia said finally. Community harmony isn't listed as grounds for an emergency meeting, Marcus replied, consulting his notes. Also, Section 4 requires 72 hours notice for all meetings, unless there's an imminent threat requiring immediate action. This meeting was called yesterday. Board member Ted Kowalski leaned over to whisper something to Patricia. She listened, her face growing redder by the second. The notice requirement was waived due to the urgent nature of the situation, she announced. What's the urgent nature? Marcus asked. My pool has been empty for 3 days. If there was an urgent threat, wouldn't it have been urgent 3 days ago? More murmurs from the crowd, these ones sounding increasingly supportive of Marcus's position. Patricia was beginning to look like someone who'd walked into a courtroom and discovered her opponent was actually a prosecutor. The point is, Patricia said, raising her voice to cut through the growing discussion, you deliberately sabotaged community property in an act of spite and revenge. Marcus smiled. Patricia, I'm curious about something. When exactly did my pool become community property? We discussed this. The board has authority to designate recreational facilities. When did the board vote on this designation? Patricia paused. It was an administrative decision based on existing bylaws. Which bylaw specifically? Another pause. 12. Marcus opened his portfolio and pulled out a copy of the HOA governing documents. I have the complete bylaws here. Section 12 covers architectural standards. There is no subsection 4, and there's certainly nothing about designating private property as community property. The crowd was getting restless now, with people turning to each other and whispering. Someone in the back called out, "Show us the bylaw." Patricia looked trapped. The document I showed you was a proposed amendment. So you're admitting you lied when you told me it was an existing bylaw? I never lied. The intent was clear. Patricia, you presented a fake legal document to justify trespassing on my property. You called the police and tried to convince them you had legal authority you didn't actually possess. That's not intent. That's fraud. The room erupted. People were standing, talking over each other, some taking pictures and videos of Patricia's increasingly panicked expression. Order, Patricia shouted, banging a gavel that looked like it had been borrowed from someone's low-thinned Halloween costume. This meeting will come to order. Marcus remained standing. I have more questions about board procedures. Sit down. You're out of order. Actually, according to Section 6-2 of the bylaws, homeowners have the right to address the board during the community input portion of meetings. When is community input scheduled for tonight? Patricia consulted her agenda, which appeared to consist of a single handwritten note. There isn't a community input, period, tonight. That's interesting, because Section 6-1 requires that all meetings include a minimum 15-minute period for homeowner input. Are you saying this isn't a valid meeting? Board member Janet Morrison, who'd been looking increasingly uncomfortable throughout this exchange, leaned over to whisper urgently to Patricia. Marcus caught fragments. Proper procedures, double quotes, and legal requirements. Patricia looked like she was developing a migraine in real time. Fine, we'll have community input. 5 minutes. The bylaws specify 15 minutes minimum, Marcus said pleasantly. 10 minutes? Patricia, the bylaws aren't a negotiation. They're the governing documents of this HOA, which you swore to uphold when you became president. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Let him talk." Others took up the chant, "Let him talk. Let him talk." Patricia looked around the room with the expression of someone watching their political career circle the drain. Fine, 15 minutes. But then we're voting to fine you for destruction of community property. Marcus smiled. That's interesting. What's the amount of the fine? $500 per day until the pool is restored to proper condition. And when did the board vote to establish this fine schedule? Patricia's mouth opened and closed without sound, because according to Section 8-3, all fines must be established by board vote with proper notice to affected homeowners. The fine schedule has to be published in advance, not created during the meeting where it's being imposed. The crowd was loving this. Marcus could see people holding up phones, streaming the systematic demolition of Patricia's authority to audiences, far beyond Willow Creek Estates. Janet Morrison stood up. I'd like to call for a brief recess. Seconded, said Ted Kowalski, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Patricia was outvoted 3-1, and the board members huddled in the corner while the packed room buzzed with excitement. Marcus could hear fragments of conversation from around the room. Did you know he could do that? I had no idea the bylaws were so specific. She's been making up rules for years. Remember when she fined the Johnsons for having the wrong color mailbox? Sarah leaned over to Marcus. You're destroying her. I'm just following the procedures she's supposed to know, Marcus replied. If she'd done her job properly, none of this would be happening. The board returned after 10 minutes, with Janet Morrison clearly having been elected as the new spokesperson. Patricia looked like she'd been crying. We'd like to propose a compromise, Janet announced. Mr. Chen, if you restore your pool to its previous condition, we'll consider this matter resolved. Marcus stood up again. I appreciate the offer, but I'm still confused about the legal basis for your authority over my pool. Could someone explain exactly when my private property became subject to board control? Janet looked at Patricia, who was staring at the table like she was trying to memorize the wood grain pattern. Well, Janet said carefully, the board felt that pools visible from common areas could be considered community amenities under certain circumstances. What circumstances specifically? When they contribute to overall property values and community enjoyment, Marcus nodded thoughtfully. That's an interesting theory. So properties that contribute to community enjoyment can be claimed by the HOA for community use. In certain situations, yes. Janet, do you have a pool? Yes, but it's not visible from the street. Ted, what about you? Ted Kowalski looked like a deer in headlights. I have a hot tub. Is it visible from common areas? Somewhat. So, according to the board's theory, your hot tub should also be available for community use. Ted's face went pale. That's different. How is it different? The room was dead silent now. Everyone watching Janet and Ted realized they'd just argued themselves into giving up their own property. And Patricia, Marcus continued, turning to the HOA president, you have that beautiful fire pit area in your front yard, very visible from the street, definitely contributes to property values. I assume that's also available for community use. Patricia finally looked up from the table. This is ridiculous.